Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us in the next hour or so. With me, the broadcaster, Henry Bonsu, and the defence correspondent for The Times, Lucy Fisher. Welcome to you both. We've got several first editions already in. Let's just have a flick through some of them. A picture of the statue of the slave trader Robert Milligan being taken down in London's Docklands earlier is featured on the front page of The Times, which reports that dozens of statues could be toppled over the links to slavery. It follows anti-racism protests in the UK and on the day of the funeral of George Floyd that had been taking place in the United States. Let's have a look at some of the international front pages now. Le Figaro has a picture of the funeral of George Floyd, a photograph of police saluting his coffin as it was taken into the Fountain of Praise Church there. On the front page of the international edition of the FT, George Floyd's family paying their last respects at his service. The Japan Times looks into the background of this. The headline in Minneapolis, anger runs deep, looking at George Floyd's death and other past claims of police brutality, in particular one person alleged to have committed a burglary being shot by police some 7 years ago. Back to the UK, take the rest of the year off, is the front page of the Eye, which reports on the potential knock-on impact that schools being closed could have on parents' work and children's education. It's after the UK government U-turned on a plan to reopen schools ahead of the summer holidays. Ministers have admitted they may not be open until September at the earliest. The Daily Express leads on the impact of months of coronavirus with news that the UK's health system could now have a general waiting list of up to 10 million people by the end of the year. And finally, on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, a photograph of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh to mark the Duke's 99th birthday in just a few hours' time. Both have been in lockdown at Windsor Castle. It was taken last Monday at the castle where the Queen has been out riding, but basically the two of them have been looked after a slimmed-down skeleton staff since lockdown was imposed. Let's start, and well, welcome to you both again. Lucy, let's look at the main news of the last few hours, really, the funeral of George Floyd, the family paying their last respects, members of the sports world, the music world, and indeed the political world, when you think about Joe Biden and the Reverend Al Sharpton in terms of civil rights taking part. This has turned into something which a lot of George Floyd's family and friends will hope will bring about some real change. Did you get that sense from the atmosphere in the funeral today?
I absolutely did. You know, a private funeral, but obviously streamed live around the world. And for me, some of the most powerful parts of that incredibly moving, very angry service was made by George Floyd's niece, who said the system is corrupt and broken. She said his death was not only a murder, but a hate crime. And riffing on the President Trump's insistence of making America great, his famous campaign slogan, she said, when was America ever great when black people are forced to suffer such brutality and prejudice? I think that will go down as a soundbite for the ages.
Henry, I'm not sure how much you managed to watch of the funeral. This is the sixth day, I think, isn't it, of official mourning for George Floyd. And when we've seen other funerals of people who've been killed in police captivity, did you think this was a slightly sort of different occasion today?
Well, it's been a huge build-up, hasn't there? I mean, remember, it's now 15 days since George Floyd was killed, and he was killed slowly on television. And there are a number of reasons why this is different from the other killings we've seen in police custody, such as, you know, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, all in the last 5 years, Philando Castile. There's so many, Ahmaud Arbery, most recently Breonna Taylor. This one was televised, it was shared, it went around the world. It happened at a time that the world felt really connected. Why? Because we were all united through concern about a pandemic. In nearly 200 countries in the world, we've all been in lockdown, we've all been told to socially distance, we've all been told to be very, very careful about how we clean ourselves, wash our hands, and so the world felt united. And then in the middle of this perfect storm, an economic meltdown, happens this. And people have been contemplating their own existence. And what can be more powerful than the image we saw of him being crushed, by asphyxiated to death slowly on camera. And so I knew this service was going to be big. It was going to be powerful. I'm not sure I would describe it as angry. I would say it was passionate, because it managed to sum up and place in a historical context going back 400 years to 1619 all the way to 2020, and done in his own inimitable way by the Reverend Al Sharpton. It was compelling, I found.
Yeah, let's just move on to the Figaro, because like other papers around the world, a picture of the casket being saluted by police officers. So much debate, though, Lucy, now about defunding state police there, reform. The Democrats are calling on reform of the police. Do you get a sense that there will be change on that front as well? I mean, President Trump has ruled it out. We had a guest on last night, actually, and I was asking how it would work. They're talking about transferring the budget of 109 million or more than that to social services to deal with the endemic problems within the black community, but in a completely different way.
Yes, I think it's very interesting, and I certainly think that the need for reform is clear. The way forward seems a little uncertain for me at present, without more consensus in the US around that. As you say, President Trump has for the moment ruled it out. But I think the important thing here is, as Henry pointed out, what was different about George Floyd's death was that it was captured on camera. In actual fact, I think in the past few days, we've seen so many numerous other appalling, shocking, hair-raising incidents of police brutality and murders that have come to the fore that people hadn't really been able to shine a light on, or many instances that were incredibly murky before now. I think that something does need to be done. Very interesting indeed to see the Minneapolis Police Department, which of course is the force responsible for the death of George Floyd, data showing that they used 11,000 instances in the past 5 years of them using force. 60% of these were against black minority ethnic people in Minneapolis, despite BME people only accounting for less than 20% of the population. So there's a huge disparity there, overrepresentation of black and minority ethnic people being targeted. So reform is needed.
Yeah, Henry, I mean, that story picks up in the Japan Times. In Minneapolis, anger runs deep. So few officers ever really end up being charged, or certainly imprisoned for some of the killings and other brutality. And I thought it was interesting that the Japan Times has concentrated on this one other man, Terence Miki Franklin, found dead. Well, you tell us the story. Found dead in 2013, and only just resolved, but with a financial deal which involved no details coming out.
Well, this is it. As is so often the case, the city ends up having to pay for the misdeeds, for what you might describe as the manslaughter or murder of African Americans. Most of these things are hidden, they're not filmed, which means it's the deceased word, he can no longer speak, against living police officers, backed up by a very, very powerful union. I mean, we talk about the power of the unions, the police unions in this country, in France, around the world, but particularly so in the States. And they name a guy who's become notorious, and he's called Bob Kroll. He's the police union president, and he always defends his officers. He thinks Black Lives Matter is an extremist, probably an Antifa a group. That's something that President Trump has been saying today as well. And so as a result of this, it is very, very hard for families to get justice. Because remember, what's got to happen is somebody's got to investigate it. And the people doing the investigating are normally very, very close to the people who do the operational policing. So you've got the police chief of a city, of a department, and then you've got the district attorney. The district attorney is an elected position, and that person is normally works very, very closely with the police. And as a result, you do get corruption. And one of the investigations that's going to be conducted into what happened with Ahmaud Arbery, and why it took over 2 months to actually arrest the three men involved in his death, is the role of the local district attorneys and how close their relationship was with the police who are meant to be investigating it. So it's extremely interesting that the Japan Times has gone into this story in such depth, focusing in on what's happened in Minneapolis and the potential for change there, because change will be coming, I think.
Yeah, and Lucy, I mean, the figure paid out £795,000, though, with a gagging clause to prevent any of the details coming out. Well, just one other thing on this particular story, which I thought was interesting, Lucy, was the fact that it's really over the last 40 years or so that there's been this spiral, because before that, relations were much better.
Yes, very interesting history. What the sort of descent to the current absolutely untenable and appalling situation in Minneapolis at present, or in recent times. Some suggestion that the death of an officer led to a huge upswell in police brutality against certain communities, leading to this incident that they describe in depth against Terrence Mookie Franklin. Found only, in a pool of blood, his body riddled with 10 bullets after he had been chased down a stairwell into a basement with a police dog, with officers, with searchlights mounted on guns. It sounds like something from a dystopian novel, but of course it's not. It's been reality for many people living in that city.
Yeah. OK, let's move on to the Times and statues. Dozens of statues could topple over slavery links. Henry, there will be people who think this is an overreaction, that this is something which is unjustified, that this is something that the country is caught up in some sort of paroxysm of self-doubt about this now. I don't expect you to agree with that, but
why not, Tim? Why not?
No, but do you want to?
Not?
No, but let's talk it through. You know, so much of our history based on people who have come through very insalubrious, repugnant business careers. What do you think, though? I mean, this idea of having a commission, this idea of removing the statues, but in a measured way. I mean, that is the best way forward, is it not?
Well, most people would agree with that. You know, we often boast in this country that we house the mother of all parliaments. We are the most mature, the most sophisticated, the oldest democracy. And we compare ourselves favourably with France, with the United States, with countries around the world. Well, here's a chance for us to prove it, because here we in Britain, we celebrate our history in a most unalloyed way. We don't like to look at the ugly bits, but there is a long arc when you look at history, from Bristol, where the statue of Edward Colston, the slave trader from the 17th century, was toppled on Sunday, through to the Caribbean and the Americas. The descendants of the enslaved who were taken from Africa by people like Colston grow up in the Caribbean and in the States, and then they feel the knee of racist and hostile police officers and sometimes state actors on their neck, both in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and then the descendants of those people here in the UK. And we are saying now, and it's not just black people, something like 70 or 80% of many of these marches are attended by young, particularly young white people who have finally said, you know what, this is no longer in our name. We want to learn about our history. We see the connection between what happened to an African-American 4,000 miles away in Minneapolis and the people we're glorifying here in this country. And there's statues up and down the UK. Black Lives Matter have drawn up what's described as a hit list of 60. But I think in anticipation of further demonstrations outside the statues of people like Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes at Oriel College, Oxford, and other actors, insalubrious actors in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Liverpool,
just on that
elsewhere.
point, I mean, I'm not sure whether you went to Oxford. I think you did.
I did,
Yeah,
yes.
you did. I mean, were you offended when you passed Oriel College on the high street there and saw that statue every day?
No, I mean, I didn't go to Oriel, and I tend to walk on the other side of the high street. So I wasn't really aware. I mean, I knew of Rhodes Scholars, the Americans who were Rhodes Scholars. But I mean, I wasn't as enlightened then as I am now. Remember, we had no social media. You're living in a student bubble. The rest of the world doesn't really exist until usually, I mean, this is my case as well. After, you know, in my fourth year, I became much more aware, much more sensitized. And then you go and get off into the world of work. Whereas it's very different for students now. They're much more plugged in, much more active, and they feel that they can make an impact, not least because they've got social media.
Lucy, do you want to quickly come in on that, or do you want to move on to the confusion, well, not confusion, but what's going to be opening from next Monday?
Well, the one thing I would just like to say quickly is that it's interesting that it's 130 Labour councils up and down the country that have agreed to review their memorials, monuments, plaques, and so forth. I think that puts incredible pressure on the Conservative government now to see what their next move is.
OK, all right, let's just look quickly. All shops can reopen from Monday if COVID's secure. So we've got non-essential shops and zoos and safari parks, but not schools.
Yes, I think a lot of people are very concerned there about the government's priority in getting non-essential shops open. Also, the plan reaffirmed today to get pubs and cafes and restaurants open on July the 4th, contrasted very starkly with the fact that 9 million pupils will have had more than 6 months off school. The plans initially to get at least primary school pupils back into the classroom before the summer has been dropped. And there's now confusion that not all not all secondary school pupils will be back in the autumn. So it's pretty chaotic on the education front, but a very grave situation. Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner, warning that this could lead to a lost generation.
Henry, just looking at the eye, take the rest of the year off. I mean, well, that explains it pretty graphically, doesn't it? Government urged to make lost education a priority. And quite a lot of criticism coming in today for Gavin Williamson, including from a former education secretary, that, you know, it does seem extraordinary, doesn't it, that the government is going to be opening pubs and things, but hasn't sorted out the education of all these children, some of whom are going to be facing GCSEs and A-levels next year, but might not even be back at school until after September.
It's a real concern, and this, to me, smacks of a failure of planning. And this is something people have criticised the government for throughout this pandemic in other aspects of it. But education is absolutely key. And you would think that if we could set up a hospital from scratch in 11 days, we could find ways of building temporary accommodation, temporary buildings, temporary space for children, certainly primary school children, to go back a little bit earlier than is currently being planned and still observe social distancing. I accept what some people say, particularly some of the teachers, that we just don't know whether or not children, even if they don't suffer from very grave symptoms, could still be spreaders or super spreaders. We still don't know that. And we've got to wait to see what kind of data comes in from other countries who are further along this path than we are. But I think it's a failure of planning, because we could have done this. We could have given children a shot at least 50% of the education, as opposed to saying you just stay at home for 3 months and what will now be 6 months.
And Lucy, the problem is so many children from underprivileged backgrounds don't have access even to a computer. They can't even get involved in Zoom tutorials, Zoom lessons.
Yes, that's right. 700,000 children are unable to access remote learning for the very reason you point out, that they don't have a computer. And I think that's a big problem here, that this failure to reopen the schools affects the most disadvantaged children the worst. You know, a lot of concern also about the fact that if schools aren't open over the summer or before the summer, you know, the school meals voucher system that's been set up during the pandemic.
I just want to get through just a couple more papers because we're running out of time. Henry, Daily Telegraph, lightning a bigger risk to pupils than COVID. You know, we get different research studies every day, don't we? WHO disagrees with other people on asymptomatic transmission rates, but children under the age of 15, it seems really unlikely to suffer the consequences of COVID-19.
Well, yeah. I mean, that headline is a really kind of grabby one. More likely to die, you know, more likely to be hit by lightning, and the chances of being hit by lightning is, obviously, we know, is infinitesimally small. I'm just looking at the risk of death by age group. We've got a helpful table on the left-hand side. So age between 15 and 24, it's 1 in 218,399. Fine, but we don't know what capacity they have to spread it. That's the problem, because these children, most of them will have at least one parent, and they will have grandparents and older people in their lives. If it was just about youngsters being hermetically sealed and only being a risk to themselves and their peers, then fine, they could go to school and there'd be no problem. But there's going to possibly a risk to teachers, some of whom could be 65 years old, and then to their kith and kin. So I would be cautious. I would be really cautious before jumping on the I suppose you might call it small government, no nanny bandwagon, which the Telegraph seems to be jumping on here.
Yeah, alongside that, a picture of the Queen and Prince Philip celebrating.
We're still shielding, I believe.
What?
I believe they're still shielding. Is that right?
They are. We're at Windsor Castle with a very skeleton staff, apparently. But the Duke of Edinburgh will have a birthday lunch with the Queen, just a picture taken last week, Lucy, and video calls from his family, which seems sensible.
Yes, well, I think the complaints of grandparents, upset about being parted from their grandchildren has been, totally understandable, frequent refrain during the crisis. So the royal family is ever trying to lead from the front by showing that they're using technology and avoiding meeting up in person to continue shielding.
All right, OK. I think we'll leave it there. You're back in about 40 minutes' time for another look at the papers. But for the time being, thank you very much indeed, both of you, Henry and Lucy. We will go back to the States because we've got our live camera up, I think, still, or we've got these live pictures in, for the interment of George Floyd's casket. Now, this is at the Houston Memorial Garden, about 10, 11 miles away from... Oh, there we go. Just as we've crossed to it, I'm afraid we've got a different feed coming in. No, we're back now. But the interment of his casket alongside that of his mother, whose nickname was Sissy. In fact, George Floyd called out her name, one of the last words he was able to say before he died, having been held in that restrained position with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck for just under 9 minutes. This follows 6 days of mourning around America. The service today lasted just under 3 hours. The eulogy was given by the civil rights leader, Reverend Al Sharpton. It was attended, though, by stars of music and sport. Jamie Foxx, NFL star J.J. Watt, among other people, and a sense of real unity and passion about how things must change in America following the death of this 46-year-old man. Of course, not the first of many black people to have been killed in police custody, but a real desire, a real hope that this death will lead to some sort of sincere change about black rights, about black lives, about how black lives matter in the United States. This helicopter shot now just capturing the final moments before the interment of George Floyd in the Memorial Garden in Houston, Texas. We'll leave you with those.